I was kneeling in the dirt when I heard the engine. Loud, heavy, coming down the street like a threat. I looked up and froze. A bulldozer, yellow, massive, and headed straight for our front yard. Behind it, a woman in a red blazer marched down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, sunglasses gleaming like a shield. Cheryl Madison, HOA president. My stomach dropped. She didn't even look at me. Mr. Thomas, you were given 3 violation notices. Today is demolition day. I couldn't breathe. Not because of fear, but because my son was sleeping just 20 feet away, IV still in his arm, watching his garden bloom from the living room window. This garden wasn't just soil and plants. It was his escape, his fight, his final wish. 2 weeks earlier. We were sitting at the dinner table when Ethan, my 9-year-old son, asked if we could plant something. Like a real garden, Dad, he said, his voice soft from the chemo. I want to wake up to sunflowers. I looked at my wife, Mia. Her eyes welled up, but she smiled. Sunflowers it is. That night, I didn't sleep. I researched which plants bloomed fastest, which soil we'd need, what kind of raised beds were wheelchair accessible. By morning, I had a plan. In one weekend, we transformed our front lawn into a patch of green heaven. We planted sunflowers, lavender, tomatoes, even a butterfly bush. Ethan watched from the porch, wrapped in blankets, his face glowing like the dawn. For the first time in months, he smiled. Not a polite one, a real one. And every morning since, that garden became his light. Until the first notice came. Unauthorized landscaping. Violation of HOA Regulation 5.4, I called Cheryl. Explained the situation. She didn't care. Front yards must maintain aesthetic uniformity, she said. Raised beds are disruptive. I offered to move them, to paint them, to make it blend in. She refused. Then came a second notice, and then a third. I tried to plead with the board during the monthly HOA meeting. Mia even brought Ethan in his wheelchair just to show them. No one looked at him. They stared at their papers. Cheryl tapped her pen the whole time. That night, Ethan cried himself to sleep. Now, the bulldozer was parked on the curb. Cheryl was talking to the driver like it was just another routine job. "This is not just a garden," I shouted. "This is for my son." Cheryl didn't even flinch. "You were warned." Ethan's voice came from behind me, weak but steady. "Dad?" I turned. He was at the door, staring at the garden. And then he saw the bulldozer. His face fell. And that's when something in me snapped. Ethan's face had turned pale. His eyes, once lit with wonder every time a new flower bloomed, were now locked on the bulldozer in disbelief. He whispered just one word. "Why?" I couldn't answer. My throat was dry. My fists clenched as Cheryl barked more orders at the driver. The sound of the engine revving brought me back to life. I stepped in front of the machine, arms wide. "You're not touching this garden," I said. "You'll have to run me over first." The driver hesitated. "Ma'am?" he asked Cheryl, looking uneasy. She waved her clipboard like a sword. "He's trespassing on HOA property. Proceed," I shouted louder. "This is our front yard. We own this home. You have no legal authority." Cheryl leaned in, smiling like a snake. "Actually, per the covenants you signed when moving into Sunny Ridge Estates, all front-facing property falls under HOA aesthetic regulation. And this," she motioned to the vibrant sunflower beds behind me, "is a breach." Before I could reply, Mia appeared behind Ethan. She wheeled him closer, her eyes blazing. "You want to bulldoze something? Bulldoze me first." The neighbors had started to gather. At first, just a few. But within minutes, a small crowd had formed across the street. Phones were out. Cameras were rolling. And then Ethan spoke again. "This garden makes me feel alive," he said. "Don't take it away." You could hear a pin drop. Even the bulldozer engine had gone quiet. But Cheryl? She didn't flinch. She turned to the driver again. 10 seconds, or I'll call your supervisor." That's when I made a choice. One I didn't know would change everything. I pulled my phone from my pocket and hit live. "Hi everyone. My name is David Thomas. I live here at 214 Magnolia Drive, And what you're seeing behind me is my son's garden. He's 9. He has cancer. And this garden was his wish. The comments began flooding in almost instantly. Wait, they're bulldozing a sick kid's garden? This is disgusting. Where is this HOA? I'm calling the news. Cheryl noticed. She tried to step between me and the camera, waving her clipboard again. That's private property. You can't record me without consent. Oh, you're worried about your rights now? I said, still streaming. Mia moved to Ethan's side and held his hand. He looked so small, so tired. But his fingers wrapped around hers tightly. That's when the unexpected happened. A man stepped out from the crowd of onlookers. He was older, with a limp and a cane. My name is Harold Simmons, he said loudly. Former HOA president of this neighborhood, before she took over. And I'm here to say this is not what we built this community for. Cheryl spun around, her voice sharp. You resigned. I was pushed out, Harold said. After I refused to sign off on the removal of a disabled woman's wheelchair ramp, remember? Gasps rippled through the neighbors. I still have the bylaws, he continued. And what she's doing today? It's not within legal grounds. Someone else stepped forward. Mrs. Alvarez. She fined us $200 for wind chimes. Said they were auditory clutter. Another neighbor joined. She threatened to tow my car because I left a single muddy footprint on the sidewalk. The crowd was growing louder, unified, but Cheryl didn't back down. You're all emotional, she hissed. This is a matter of order, of rules. Ethan looked up from his chair. Then your rules are broken. That one sentence broke through the crowd like a wave. People began chanting. Save the garden. Let the boy live. Shame on you, Cheryl. Cheryl's composure cracked. Her voice trembled. This is harassment. You're all violating community decorum. Decorum? I said, stepping toward her. You sent a bulldozer to tear out a dying child's last wish. Then, sirens. A police cruiser turned the corner, lights flashing. 0000 again. Another reset. Another scene that would burn into my memory. The officer stepped out and approached slowly. What's going on here? Cheryl rushed over. Officer, thank goodness. This man is refusing to comply with an HOA removal order. The officer raised a hand. I'll speak with everyone, one at a time. I handed him my phone, showing the state permit I'd acquired for the raised beds. He nodded. Then Harold stepped up. Sir, I served on this board. I can confirm that the new regulation Cheryl claims gives her this power. It was never voted on. The officer turned back to Cheryl. Ma'am, he said, you have the right to enforce HOA regulations. But if the residents believe there was no due process, and if this garden is tied to an ADA consideration due to medical necessity, this is no longer a civil matter. This is federal. The word federal hung in the air like thunder. Cheryl's face drained of color. I suggest you stand down, the officer said. She hesitated. Just for a second. Then she turned to the bulldozer driver and snapped, Pack it up! Applause erupted. People hugged. Mia cried openly. Ethan smiled. And the garden? It stood untouched. But I knew better than to celebrate too soon. This wasn't over. It was just past midnight when I heard the soft clink of something tapping against the front door. I froze. It wasn't loud, not aggressive like Karen's usual tactics, but it was deliberate. A soft tap, like someone wanted to send a message without waking the whole neighborhood. I grabbed my phone, activated the porch camera feed, and pressed record. The screen flickered for a moment before showing a figure in a hoodie walking away. The camera caught just a glimpse of their face as they turned back for a split second. It wasn't Karen. It was someone younger, maybe one of her new volunteers. I stepped outside. Hanging from a piece of twine tied to the doorknob was a plastic bag. Inside, a single page, folded in half and sealed with tape. My name was written on the front in sharp, blocky letters. I peeled it open carefully. You're not helping your son. You're using him. That was all it said. No name, no signature. Just cold, anonymous cruelty. I stood there for a while, heart pounding, the words burning into my hands. I thought about going back inside, but then I looked over at the garden. The one thing I'd managed to protect so far. The motion light on the shed flickered, casting long shadows across the raised beds and wooden archway. It looked fragile in the dark. When I walked back into the house, Sarah was already awake, sitting on the stairs. Her eyes locked onto mine, and she knew. Another message? I nodded. Worse this time. She didn't say anything right away, just stood and walked over, pulling me into a hug. They're getting scared, she said quietly. That's why they're lashing out. But I wasn't sure anymore who they really were, because the next morning, I found something else. My compost bin, the one I'd locked the night before, was overturned. Not just knocked over, but gutted. The contents had been dumped across the path, and someone had written the word toxic in orange spray paint across the side of the shed. This time I didn't call the HOA, I called the police. Officer Davidson arrived within 20 minutes, clipboard in hand, tired eyes beneath his cap. You again, he said with a sigh, not unkindly. What now? I showed him the footage, the note, the shed. He nodded slowly. I've had 3 other calls from this block in the last 2 weeks. Mostly anonymous threats, minor vandalism. You're not the only one. Do you think it's Karen? He shrugged. Could be. Or someone working for her. Either way, it's not just HOA drama anymore. You might want to consider installing floodlights, motion sensors, maybe even a private security detail. The words hit harder than I expected. We weren't celebrities. We were just a family trying to keep our son's world intact. That evening, after cleaning up the mess, I sat with Noah in the garden. He was painting a small wooden sign we'd started together earlier in the week. His brush strokes were slow but careful, each color picked with thoughtful precision. When he finished, he held it up proudly. My peace place, he said. That's what I want to call it. I smiled, swallowing the lump in my throat. It's perfect. But just as I leaned in to hug him, my phone buzzed. An email alert. I glanced at the screen, and my blood ran cold. Subject, HOA Emergency Enforcement Review. Lot 23, Violation Escalation. Body, per executive vote, non-member appeal denied. Demolition notice for unauthorized structure to proceed within 72 hours. Garden enclosure deemed non-compliant. They were going to tear it down. No hearing, no appeal window. Just a date and a time. Saturday, 10 a.m., 3 days. I rushed inside, printed the notice, and laid it on the dining table like evidence in a trial. Sarah stared at it in disbelief. They're not even pretending anymore, she whispered. No, I said, because they don't have to. Karen stacked the board before the last meeting. Everyone on it now is one of her picks. Sarah paced the kitchen, eyes sharp with fury. We need to stop this. If they take that garden, it's not just about aesthetics. They're taking Noah's therapy, his sanctuary. I know. We spent that night calling everyone we trusted. Neighbors who had quietly supported us. Former board members who had stepped down when Karen started tightening her grip. Even the local news tip line. But no one picked up. And then, someone did. It was Amanda Keller, an investigative reporter for the regional paper. She'd covered HOA corruption scandals before, some of which had ended in indictments. I sent her the documents, the photos, the footage. She asked one question before agreeing to come over the next day. Is your son willing to talk to me? I hesitated. But before I could answer, Noah, who had been sitting nearby, nodded. I want them to know why I built it, he said softly. I want them to understand. The next afternoon, Amanda arrived with a notepad and a small camera. Noah led her into the garden himself. He showed her the bench where he sat after seizures, the herbs he used in his cooking therapy, the corner where he buried a toy soldier from the hospital, a symbol of what he'd survived. Amanda was silent the whole time, just listening, just recording. When the interview ended, she turned to me and said, They're going to regret touching this. but by the time Friday night came, the trucks had already arrived. 2 large maintenance vehicles parked down the street, engines idling. Sarah stood at the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. "They're coming," she said, and I nodded. But this time, we weren't going to let them win. Not without a fight. The morning of the demolition felt colder than usual, though the forecast had promised sun. I didn't sleep the night before. None of us did. Even Noah had stayed awake until nearly dawn, clutching the little wooden sign he painted. My peace place. At exactly 9:32 a.m., the first orange-vested worker stepped onto our property. I was already standing at the edge of the garden, arms crossed, Sarah beside me in her wheelchair, Darnell behind us with his hands in his jacket pockets, calm but alert. Then came Cheryl Langley, red lipstick, stiff gray blazer, clipboard tucked tightly under one arm like it was a badge of honor. "Mr. Alvarez," she called, as if this were a neighborhood bake sale. "This isn't personal, it's procedural. Please stand back so the crew can begin safely." I stepped forward, voice steady but loud enough for the workers to hear. "You're about to destroy an ADA-certified therapy space built for a child with a diagnosed neurological condition. You sure you want to put your name on that?" Cheryl didn't flinch. "There is no documentation proving medical necessity filed with the board." Sarah wheeled forward. "You never gave us the opportunity. You denied our appeals without reading them. And you," Cheryl said coldly, turning to Sarah, "are no longer a voting member of this HOA." That's when the gate creaked open. Amanda Keller, the journalist, stepped into the yard holding a press badge and a boom mic. "I'm sorry. Are you aware this is being filmed for a story currently under editorial review at the Tribune?" she asked, stepping beside us. Cheryl blinked. This is private property," she snapped. Amanda smiled, not moving. "Correct, and the homeowners have invited me." The workers hesitated, shovels half raised. Cheryl looked down the street. More neighbors were emerging, some cautiously, some boldly. Mr. Patel stood with his arms crossed. The Chens were filming from their front porch. Even old Mrs. Jenkins had come outside, holding her potted azaleas like they were armor. Cheryl's voice cracked just slightly. "This is illegal removal of a non-compliant structure." Amanda raised her mic. "What state statute authorizes an HOA to override federal ADA protections?" That's when the second surprise arrived. A black sedan pulled up behind the utility truck. The door opened slowly, and out stepped a tall man in a dark gray suit. "Name's Marshall Vega," he said as he approached. "Legal counsel for the Alvarez family. Cheryl, I trust you received my cease and desist letter this morning?" Her face paled. "That letter was addressed to a private board," she said, suddenly unsure. Vega held up a printed order. "This is an emergency injunction filed with the county this morning at 8:14 a.m. You are hereby prohibited from removing, altering, or tampering with the Alvarez property until further notice." The workers dropped their tools. Cheryl's mouth opened, then closed. "You'll be hearing from our legal team," she muttered, then turned and stormed off without another word. Applause erupted from across the block. But the moment felt heavier than victory. Because we all knew. This wasn't the end. It was the start of something deeper. That afternoon, I sat with Noah in the garden while Sarah met with Vega inside. Noah placed his little sign, "My peace place," back into the soil like it was a flag. "Are they going to come again?" he asked quietly. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But we're ready this time." He nodded, then surprised me with a question. "Can we build something new here? For other kids too?" I looked at him, eyes wide. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Some kids don't have peace places. What if we made one they could visit?" It hit me like a wave. This wasn't just his sanctuary anymore. It was becoming something bigger. Over the next few days, Sarah and I worked non-stop. While Vega prepared formal charges against the HOA's board for discriminatory practices, Amanda Keller's article hit the front page. "A Garden Under Siege: How One HOA Declared War on a Child Sanctuary." It spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, 3 other families in surrounding neighborhoods contacted us. All of them had similar stories: sensory gardens, mobility ramps, even shaded play spaces, all threatened or destroyed under flimsy HOA pretexts. By Wednesday, a new group had formed: Families for Accessible Communities. Sarah was voted as an honorary chair. Meanwhile, Cheryl's tactics grew sloppier. She issued another round of citations, this time for unpermitted murals, referencing a small painted stone Noah had placed by the compost bin. But this time, neighbors fought back. The Patels refused their noise violation. The Jenkins family filed a counterclaim for harassment. Carlos, the retired firefighter, went door to door with a petition to suspend all board activity pending a full vote. The community was waking up. And Cheryl? She was losing control. That Thursday, during a surprise HOA meeting that Cheryl tried to hold at 2 p.m. on a workday, something unprecedented happened. Only 3 people showed up, because everyone else, over 40 residents, were already gathered on our lawn, together. Families, retirees, parents with toddlers, veterans, teens, and Noah, sitting in the middle of his garden, painting a new sign. This one read, "Our Peace Place." The first mural went up on a Sunday morning. It wasn't commissioned, approved, or even planned. It just appeared. A swirling ribbon of colors along the side fence facing the street. Handprints, hearts, and in bold blue letters, "Our Peace Place." At the center, a simple message: "Welcome, always." Noah had started it with his friend Ava, who lived 2 houses down. Her younger brother had sensory processing disorder, and for the first time, he felt safe in our backyard garden. Ava had asked if they could add something to make it theirs too. I'd said yes without hesitation. By noon, 10 more kids had joined, then parents. Then Carlos arrived with a ladder and added a blooming sunflower that stretched halfway to the sky. It was no longer just a garden, it was a message. And Cheryl Langley hated messages she didn't write herself. That evening we found a notice nailed to our fence post. Literally nailed, like it was 1823. Unpermitted exterior artistic alteration, Class 2 violation. I stared at the words, fists clenched. Artistic alteration? As if Noah's garden had become graffiti. Sarah read it in silence, then walked over and calmly peeled the notice off the wood. "She's not coming for the paint," she said. "She's coming for the movement." And she was right. Overnight, 3 more families received similar citations. The Patels for a chalk drawing on their driveway. The Chens for hanging paper lanterns in their tree. The Simons for a wooden sign that read, "Kindness is free." This wasn't enforcement, it was retaliation. The next day, Marshal Vega came by with updates. "She filed an injunction against you," he said, setting a folder on our kitchen table. "She's accusing your family of inciting neighborhood disorder, encouraging vandalism, and violating HOA visual compliance codes." I nearly laughed. "By letting kids paint a fence?" Vega didn't smile. "That's how they twist it. But we're ready." He handed Sarah another folder. "We're going on offense now. We'll counter-sue for targeted discrimination, abuse of power, and violation of your child's rights under the ADA." Sarah nodded. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Vega said. "They've called for an emergency vote. Cheryl's trying to replace the interim board, with her people." That night, we held another town meeting. Not at the community center this time. It had been mysteriously locked for maintenance. Instead, we met in the Alvarez garden, lit by solar lanterns and dotted with painted stones. Over 60 people showed up. Sarah addressed them, calm but powerful. "This isn't about a fence or a flower. It's about whether we get to define what safety, community, and dignity look like in our own neighborhood." Then she revealed the most explosive piece of evidence yet. From her wheelchair pouch, she pulled out a printed invoice, signed by Cheryl Langley, authorizing payment to a security firm named Clearview Community Integrity. The problem? The firm didn't exist, at least not legally. Darnell had cross-referenced the name through every state database. No license, no tax ID, nothing. But residents remembered the name. It had appeared at the bottom of warning letters, ticket slips, and surveillance photos sent to residents over the past 2 years. A shadow enforcement group. Fake citations. Intimidation posing as order. She created her own secret police, Carlos muttered. And Cheryl's signature was on every check. By the time the emergency board vote arrived, tensions were sky high. Flyers had been distributed. Restore order to Oak Crest Ridge. Protect our standards. Reject the chaos. Each with a stern photo of Cheryl, arms crossed beside a photo of our mural, cropped to make it look like a mess of anarchist scribbles. But something unexpected happened. When residents arrived at the polling station, they were greeted by volunteers and reporters. Amanda Keller had returned, now with a crew from the local CBS affiliate. "We're covering this live," she told Cheryl, who had arrived flanked by 2 of her supporters. "I hope that's all right." Cheryl's jaw locked. "This is private association business." Amanda just smiled. "Not when it's publicly funded roads, publicly accessible polling, and publicly documented abuse allegations." Inside the voting tent, it became clear. Cheryl had underestimated the community. Dozens of residents brought copies of Sarah's legal brief. Mr. Patel handed out pamphlets with the fake security firm exposé. And Noah, sweet, quiet Noah, stood beside the mural with a paintbrush in hand, offering free swirls of color to anyone who wanted to add their name. By 7 p.m., the vote count began. When the results were posted, the air held its breath. Proposed board replacement, rejected. Cheryl Langley, removed from all advisory roles. Community Oversight Committee, approved. Applause, hugs, tears, and for the first time in weeks, laughter. Sarah looked around and whispered to me, "This isn't the end." I raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" She nodded toward the press crew still filming Cheryl, who stood frozen in disbelief. "Because people like her don't go quietly. They regroup." Then she turned to me with fire in her eyes. "But this time, so do we." The silence after Cheryl's removal didn't feel like peace. It felt like a storm holding its breath. For the first time in months, our inbox wasn't flooded with violations. The community Facebook group went from chaos to cautious optimism. And our front porch, once a battleground, now held a basket of muffins and a handwritten card from the Jenkins family. "Thank you for helping us breathe again. But we'd lived through too many false calms to trust this one, and we were right not to." It began with an envelope, no return address, slipped under our door one night after midnight. Inside was a single photograph, a blurry image of our garden fence, taken from behind a bush, the mural still fresh, Noah's name still visible in bold red paint, and one word scribbled in pen across the bottom: "Soon." The next day, Darnell reviewed the footage. 2 figures, hooded, no plates, professional-grade gear, he muttered, adjusting the contrast on the grainy nighttime clip. "They're not amateurs. This wasn't some bored teenager." Sarah stood behind him, arms crossed tightly. "She's watching again." "Or, she never stopped," I added. That evening, we met with Robert Mitchell and Marshall Vega. We laid out every piece of evidence: the threats, the forged citations, the fake security firm. Vega looked up from the documents. "She's testing boundaries, seeing how much she can get away with now that she's not officially in power." Mitchell nodded. "But you said she's still living on the edge of the neighborhood, right? Still connected to those 3 board members who refused to resign?" Sarah didn't blink. "She's using them, like she used Cheryl. A mouthpiece, a shield. And that's when Vega dropped the next bombshell. She's applied for a special permit to host a community restoration roundtable." Sarah furrowed her brow. "What kind of permit?" "The kind that lets her gather HOA residents under the guise of discussion, without needing official board approval. She's hosting it. At her home." We made a decision that night. If Karen wanted to bring the war to her doorstep again, we'd meet her there. But this time, with light. The following Saturday, just before dusk, cars began arriving at the far end of Oak Crest Ridge. We watched from 2 blocks away as residents hesitantly entered Karen's front lawn, now lined with white folding chairs, iced tea stands, and a vinyl banner that read, "Reclaiming Our Roots, a New Vision for Oak Crest." It would have been charming if we hadn't known the rot beneath it. Sarah, Robert, Darnell, and I waited until the gathering reached its peak. Then we stepped forward. Not to disrupt, not to protest, but to observe. And to document. Karen's voice rang through the microphone as we approached. "We've lost our identity, our values, our harmony, and it's time we bring back order." She spotted Sarah from the corner of her eye and nearly flinched, but she didn't stop. "But this isn't about power, it's about community, a community that knows its place, that respects tradition." Sarah wheeled closer. "And whose tradition is that, Karen?" The crowd turned. Karen froze, microphone still in hand. Sarah didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You talk about harmony, but you built a fortress of silence. You call it tradition, but it's control. You use rules like weapons, not tools." A few neighbors nodded. Quiet murmurs spread. Karen recovered quickly. "Governor Reynolds, this is a private gathering." "Then why did you file for a public permit?" Sarah held up the paperwork. "Or did you think no one would check?" Karen's eyes narrowed. But the damage was done. A man stood near the back, one of Cheryl's former allies. "I thought this was going to be about rebuilding," he said, voice uncertain. "Not whatever this is." Sarah turned toward him. "It can be. But not with her leading it." By the end of the night, more than half the attendees had left early. Karen stood alone under her banner, surrounded only by her most loyal, most fearful few. And in the days that followed, things escalated. 2 homes were egged. 1 mailbox was smashed. And then came the worst of it. Mrs. Kaplan's car windows shattered in the middle of the night. No theft, just destruction. The word, "puppet," spray-painted on the hood. She'd been one of the loudest voices at the last vote, and one of the earliest supporters of Sarah's reform. The message was clear. This wasn't just intimidation. It was a purge. Vega filed for an emergency restraining order against Karen and her known affiliates. Darnell installed new cameras and increased patrol routes. But even with everything, the fear was spreading again. Some neighbors stopped attending meetings. Others removed their lawn signs. A few returned to whispering at the mailbox. Sarah called an emergency assembly at the community center. This time, nearly 100 people showed up. She stood before them, voice steady but urgent. "I know this is scary. I know it feels like we're back where we started. But let me be clear. What we're facing now is the last gasp of a failed system. And that system is desperate." She held up a folder. Inside, proof of forged communications between Karen and the supposed community integrity firm, which, it turns out, was just a P.O. box in another state. "She's running out of tools, so she's trying to scare us into submission. But we've come too far, and if we stand together, she won't win." That night, the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't applaud. They stood. One by one, without prompting, they rose to their feet. And in that quiet, defiant unity, something stronger than fear began to grow. It all came to a head on a rainy Thursday evening. Gray skies pressed down on Oak Crest Ridge like a warning. Streets were slick, reflections of porch lights rippling across puddles. And in the community center, every seat was filled. Some residents stood in the back, others leaned against the walls, arms folded tightly, eyes sharper than ever before. No one was here for potlucks or policy updates. They were here for war. Sarah wheeled to the front of the room and placed a thick binder on the podium, one that had grown with each chapter of this fight. She looked out at the crowd. Old faces, new faces. Some afraid, others furious. All of them tired, but all of them still standing. Then she spoke. "This is the final vote." A ripple went through the crowd. "Not just about Karen," she continued. "About everything she stood for. About whether we keep letting fear dictate our neighborhood, or whether we rewrite the rules for good." She opened the binder. Inside were the signatures of over 300 homeowners. A legal petition to permanently dissolve the old HOA charter and replace it with the new, transparent, resident-led structure, the Oak Crest Community Council. But just as she began reading the motion aloud, the doors burst open. Rain blew in, and behind it stood Karen Thompson. She didn't look like the power-wielding tyrant from the early months. She looked worn down, hair damp, blazer askew, heels clicking too loudly against the floor. But her voice? Still sharp as a dagger. "This vote is illegal," she snapped. "You don't have jurisdiction. This is a smear campaign, nothing more." Murmurs rose from the crowd. Robert Mitchell stood. "You lost your authority the moment you forged signatures and funneled funds through fake vendors." Karen glared. "You're all traitors. You don't know what it takes to preserve a community." Sarah didn't flinch. "Preserving community doesn't mean punishing people who paint their doors blue or install ramps for their children." Karen's voice cracked. "You think you're better than me? Just because of some wheelchair and a sob story?" The room went dead silent. Then Mr. Rodriguez stood. "My son served 2 tours overseas. He came back in a wheelchair. And you fined me for installing a ramp. So yes, I think she's better than you." Then Mrs. Chen rose. "You destroyed my garden. That was my husband's therapy before he passed. You called it clutter. I call it love." And then, one by one, the rest stood too. The Patels, the Kaplans, the Simons, even Jackson, his veteran's cap clenched in one hand. Sarah turned back to the podium. "This isn't personal anymore, Karen. It's collective, it's legal, and it's over." She looked to the front row. "Motion to dissolve Oak Crest Ridge HOA as currently chartered, and replace it with a publicly elected community council. All in favor?" Hands went up. Rows and rows of hands. The count wasn't close. 312 to 5. Karen stood frozen. She looked around, searching for even one loyal face. But there were none. Then, with a final glare, she stormed out, her heels echoing down the hallway like a retreating army. The following week was like breathing in after a hurricane. The signs came down, the citations stopped, the red letters on mailboxes vanished. And then came the reconstruction. Sarah's new council met in an open session on the community lawn. No closed doors, no secret votes. The first order of business? Restoring what had been broken. Mr. Rodriguez's ramp was rebuilt, this time with help from 5 neighbors. Mrs. Chen's garden returned, bigger, brighter, and now a centerpiece of the block. Even the Simons' sensory-friendly yard, once targeted for aesthetic disruption, was designated an accessibility innovation zone. The bylaws were rewritten, this time with real lawyers, real oversight, real fairness. And Karen? Her house was listed for sale within a week. She never said goodbye. No one asked her to. 1 month later, Sarah stood once more on the community center stage. Not as a governor, not as a wheelchair user, but as a neighbor. "This isn't the end of the fight," she said. "It's the beginning of the standard." She held up a printed copy of a newly passed local law, inspired by her efforts, titled the Community Rights and Fairness Act. It mandated transparent HOA elections, capped fines, and banned discriminatory enforcement practices. Towns across the state had already adopted it. Her voice didn't tremble as she spoke the final line. "If you're watching this from somewhere else, if you think you're alone, you're not." We stood up, and so can you. That weekend, neighbors gathered to paint a mural across the community garden wall. In the center of it, a bold rising sun, and beneath it, the words that had become a promise. "Light always returns."